Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're undertaking a serious business investigation. We're looking at a healthcare startup that promised an absolute medical revolution, yet delivered one of Silicon Valley's most controversial failures. This is the story of Theranos, and it's a fascinating look at how a seemingly unstoppable corporate empire can crumble to the ground when it's built on an unstable foundation. Okay, let's dive into this. $9 billion. Just take a moment to really look at that number. That was the peak valuation of Theranos. It represents the immense financial stakes of an empire built entirely on a promise, an empire that eventually collapsed to zero. So, how exactly does a company reach this staggering height and then completely vanish? To understand this, we're going to conduct a sort of corporate autopsy today. We'll look at the initial vision to change healthcare, how they built a billion-dollar empire, the missing technological foundation, the moment trust finally collapsed, and finally, the vital business lessons from a failed empire. We're skipping the sensational gossip here and focusing strictly on the business and leadership mechanics.
Let's start with Section 1, Division to Change Healthcare, and the promise of a medical revolution.
You know, the foundation of this company wasn't built on working machines. It was actually built on an incredibly compelling narrative. The promise was simple, but it was magnetic. A company promised to change healthcare. Investors believed it, and the media celebrated it. The vision was to fundamentally revolutionize blood testing, making it accessible from just a tiny prick of the finger. This powerful storytelling drew in massive media coverage and incredible investor hype, because, honestly, everyone wanted this medical revolution to be true. Now, what's really interesting here is the sharp contrast, because while magazine covers and tech conferences were celebrating a breakthrough, the reality was nothing but unverified claims hidden behind a billion-dollar dream. The gap between the ambitious promises made in these stories and the actual technological capability of the company was absolutely massive, but it was entirely obscured by the brilliance of the dream itself. Which brings us to Section 2, Building a Billion-Dollar Empire and Understanding Silicon Valley Investor Psychology. So how does a company just bypass standard healthcare checks? Well, it really comes down to psychology. Driven by the fear of missing out, or FOMO, investors simply skipped standard tech verifications. Their deep belief in the vision actually caused them to ignore missing laboratory data. And because they trusted the high-profile corporate leadership board, they relied on reputation over actual peer-reviewed results. It was this specific investor psychology that allowed the startup to bypass the checks and balances that usually protect capital in the healthcare sector. Let's move along and see how this builds, because this psychology fueled a very precise, albeit dangerous, sequence. First, powerful storytelling hooked the listener and promised to change the world. Second, media hype and celebration validated that story to the public without anyone actually checking the science. And third, leveraging that public trust into a massive $9 billion valuation. The company artificially inflated its growth using reputation, branding, and charisma, rather than deploying a functioning medical product. We now enter the most critical part of this autopsy with Section 3, the missing technological foundation, and the core problem brewing beneath the surface. There was an incredibly dangerous disconnect defining the company. The public pitch was a complete revolution in blood testing, but the guarded reality? Unsolved core engineering problems and a complete lack of validation. Inside those highly guarded laboratory spaces, the machines simply could not do what the executives are claiming they could do. Because the core engineering problems were never actually solved, the company had to resort to hiding its technological shortcomings just to maintain that massive valuation. If you take away anything from this case study, let it be this definition of technology validation. It's the critical process of verifying that a technology actually performs its intended function safely, which is especially vital in healthcare businesses. Look, when you scale a healthcare startup before solving and validating your core engineering problems, you are taking a fatal risk. Moving fast and breaking things might work for a social media app, for sure, but in medicine, skipping validation literally risks human lives. So the crucial point is how the internal environment handled these failures. And they did it through a severe lack of internal transparency. Departments were heavily siloed, and that led to compromised communication. Leadership consistently made decisions prioritizing rapid growth and public relations over necessary scientific verification. Ultimately, they built a corporate culture that was completely dedicated to masking technological failures rather than fixing them. This high-pressure leadership style made the technological gap practically impossible to bridge. But eventually, the curtain falls. Section 4,
when trust finally collapses and the evaporation of credibility. Let's trace how this happened, because the downfall followed a clinical rapid sequence. Phase 1, hidden technology problems began to emerge as grave whistleblowers inside the company grew really uncomfortable with the ethical and medical risks. Phase 2, external investigations into the company began. This was spearheaded by journalists and eventually regulatory bodies who demanded to finally see the missing data. And Phase 3, the complete collapse of the startup empire. Once a business loses trust, especially in healthcare where credibility is your most valuable asset, that business evaporates almost overnight. And this brilliantly illustrates just how fast that happens. The financial devastation was total. A peak valuation of a staggering $9 billion evaporated to absolutely zero. All that paper wealth, built entirely on storytelling and reputation, vanished the second the underlying truth saw the light of day.
Which leads us to our final synthesis in Section 5, Lessons from a Failed Empire and a Blueprint for the Future. Let's objectively distill the core takeaways from this corporate autopsy for any future builder or investor out there. First, a compelling vision must always be supported by actual, tangible execution. Second, true innovation requires strict, peer-reviewed verification. Third, prioritizing rapid growth without building strong operational and technological foundations creates massive systemic risk. And finally, company culture directly influences long-term success. A culture of secrecy, lack of transparency, and intense internal pressure will ultimately destroy a company from the inside out. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. Has the Silicon Valley ecosystem truly learned the lessons of this $9 billion collapse? Or are investors still susceptible to prioritizing powerful storytelling and charismatic leadership over verified data? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into the mechanics of building and breaking a startup empire has provided you with valuable, actionable insights for the future.